Staki mbwembwana kwele mchele kwa kuku kumwaga. Sako na wapenda yatusema nitasikia.
Hi, my name is McGuire Price. I'm a rising sophomore at Northwestern University, and I'm majoring in theater and minoring in film studies and business institutions. So I'm here to talk today about my passion for theater, acting, and film, and also about accessibility, specifically when it comes to making those mediums more accessible to the deaf community as an audience and as participants. So I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, which is a southern part of the US, and this area isn't really the epicenter of the arts, so to speak, but the main dominating entertainment down here is definitely sports. So most of my life I did sports, all kinds of sports, football, baseball, basketball, you name it. But it wasn't until the summer before 8th grade that I was allowed to participate in a theater summer camp, and it absolutely changed my life and my view on what I wanted to do as a person and as a performer. So from then on, I started to involve myself in as many activities as I could, and I tried to expose myself to the world of acting. I did after-school programs, professional jobs, and like the big kind of climax of that time was I was accepted to a fine arts school. But it wasn't until sophomore year that I started to unknowingly discover a subsection of theatrical practices that is more often than not overlooked in mainstream productions, which was accessibility. One day during a rehearsal, my friend and I wanted to talk backstage, and one of the big things about backstage is you're supposed to be silent because you don't want to interrupt what's going on stage. So one way we were trying to be clever was that we would learn sign language and sign backstage. So we could still talk and we were still silent, but we were kind of finding a loophole. And she already knew the alphabet, so she started teaching me. And before she started teaching me, I really didn't think much of it. But as she showed me the signs, I realized how beautiful a language it was, and I really just got hooked. And that started my obsession with teaching myself ASL, and it continued really for the next few years. And at first this was just a hobby, but it wasn't until I saw Deaf West's version of Spring Awakening on Broadway that I realized really the applicability of the language in the arts. In this show, the actors used spoken English and ASL simultaneously and had a mixture of both hearing and deaf actors. I was simply taken away by the beauty of the ASL at the moment, and really after that performance I wondered, like, why isn't this being shown more? Why isn't this practice more mainstream than it is? But as I started to really meditate on that question and many others, because there are many others that go along with it, I realized that for years I was completely ignoring my own privileged view as a hearing person in theatrical spaces. Theater itself has been a very verbal tradition. Normally it is composed of actors on stage talking to each other or by themselves. You have sound effects. You have, really it's a very hearing-based art practice. So for a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, the obstruction of that hearing barrier completely excludes that group of people from experiencing something that has been so pivotal throughout my life. My ability to hear allows me to be welcomed in this space and allows me to experience that art form. But if I wasn't able to hear, then I would have had a total different trajectory. And one way that I even kind of let my own privilege prevent myself from seeing the whole picture when it comes to accessibility is through my previous view of interpreters in theater as being the end of the path for accessibility. And before I get into this example, I don't want to discredit interpreters in mainstream theater. I think it's great. It is a way of reaching a more accessible theatrical space. Mainly, I'm just here to maybe acknowledge the fact that we could go further in accessibility that isn't as talked about. So early on, my quick fix to the problem of accessibility for the deaf community was to add more interpreters to the theater scene. And while this does sound like the perfect solution, this add-on to the mainstream theater more often than not forgets about the main sense that deaf people use when it comes to communicating, which is their eyes. So when you think about an interpreter, normally an interpreter is off stage and normally to the side of the stage. So what happens is, for a deaf audience member, in order to understand what's being communicated or what's happening on stage, they really have to look away from the stage and focus more on the interpreter rather than the actors who were paid to be on stage, who are emoting, who are going through emotions, who are throwing things, who are using props. All the facets that really make theater is kind of watered down into this interpreter on the side of the stage who is pretty much just translating what they're saying. It's almost like a storyteller. And really, this just doesn't give deaf audiences the full experience of a theatrical show. And one way that I have seen, and I saw this specifically in Spring Awakening, Deaf West Spring Awakening, is really the inclusion of ASL and deaf actors in these shows. In addition to hearing actors, but really making sure that shows have both spoken English and ASL, which allows audiences that are both hearing and deaf to experience the same thing, the same theatrical experience. It doesn't force deaf audiences to look away from what's happening on stage. It allows them to just witness the actions happening the same as a hearing person. And also, this would not only increase accessibility for the viewers and the people in the audience, but it would allow for more representation and more jobs for deaf performers. While there are many facets of accessibility for the deaf community, I mainly just want to implore y'all to think about how accessible is your everyday life, job, hobbies, entertainment, etc. And additionally, what groups of people are excluded from it, and how can you include them? This whole experience, this whole path for me in pretty much being shown ASL and being aware of this group of people that are normally excluded from theater, and specifically mainstream theater, has really, really opened my eyes on showing me a way that I can both do something I love and be a part of an industry that I get so much joy out of, but also finding ways to make it more accessible and finding ways for other people to also fall in love with theater, the arts, and have a place in it and be able to participate in it. And not only does this apply to people that are deaf, but it also applies to different ways that people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, people of different races, genders, sexualities, people that aren't a part of the mainstream idea of what is the normal person, quote unquote. How can you involve them in those spaces? Personally, I ask myself this question every day in everything I do, and really try to just think of ways that I myself can be aware of it and I myself can make a change. It's been a crazy time, but I would not go back for $1 million. And that's just kind of how I want to go forward in theater and accessibility and work with more people with different views, because in the end, embracing those different views allows you to become so much more versatile as a person and a performer.
Nanipaga moyo nikianza kulia chozi nafutia.